The recent Paris summit was hosted with the aim of finding ways to support struggling African economies. It comes amid the global downturn brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic. More than 12 African countries, including South Africa, sent their leaders. The summit's outcome was an agreement that wealthier nations will reallocate about 1.4 trillion rand in International Monetary Fund reserves to African states. But is this a feasible goal? To tell us or give us the answer to this question, we're joined by Dr. Nthabiseng Moleko, who's development and economist from the University of Stellenbosch Business School. She joins me alongside Biniza, who is the Finance and Operations Director at Political Economy South Africa. A pleasure to have you both on the program this evening. Sia, I'll start with you. This is an Africa Financing for Development Summit. It was not a gathering of just Francophone countries. There were also other countries attending, some of who belong to the SADC region. What is the significance of this in your view?
So I think the significance of this is as we enter the recovery period from the COVID-19 pandemic, we're seeing a divergence between the ability of advanced economies in dealing with the pandemic versus African or low and medium income countries. And really what the summit is bringing to the fore is how can advanced economies assist with the economic recovery as well as the COVID-19 pandemic recovery in low and middle income African countries. Because as you know, the only way forward from the COVID-19 pandemic is through the success of the global vaccine rollout. And so without leaving African countries behind, advanced economies have come together in order to find some additional assistance to what has been an ongoing process from the debt suspension initiative by the G20, which is now culminating in a common framework on how to assist African countries deal with debt, but also providing additional financing for access to vaccines as well as the economic recovery from the pandemic. So that really is a roundup of the significance for African countries.
Dr. Moleko, as a follow-up question, now this meeting was largely on finance for development in Africa and averting another government debt crisis as the one seen in the 1970s as well as the 2000s. How critical is this subject in context of the current times that we are living in, considering this pandemic, and our countries in the developed world noticing a divergence coming out of this COVID-19 pandemic?
So what we've seen on the continent, Nhlanhla, is that the continent's median debt level as a percentage of GDP has declined. This was since 2010. But what we've seen in the last 5 years is that there's been a strong growth towards a higher level of median debt, particularly when you see the staggering 5 percentage point annual increase from 2014 to 2016. This also increased substantially when you began to see the effect of COVID. What is surprising, though, is when many OECD economies were using their central banks as the lender of last resort, African economies were going to Bretton Woods institutions and getting dollar-denominated debt, very expensive way to service the fiscal deficits, when OECD economies and richer countries were actually using their central banks quite innovatively, enabling them to actually recover quite quickly and very cheaply. So you're seeing that the method that Africans continue to make use of in getting out of the quagmire is to borrow from foreign national or multilateral agencies, even though it's I'd say, a corporate move. Is it perhaps the best approach to dealing with the fiscal deficit? I think the second issue that you have raised around the debt issue is how do we develop African countries' efficiency in collecting tax revenue more sufficiently, dealing with illicit capital outflows, dealing with enhancing up to 110 billion that is lost primarily through illicit capital flows over accumulated period of time. Companies are shifting profits and tax locations to low tax locations, and sometimes it's not even done according to legislation, and we are not decisively dealing with this. So in order to increase the revenue that is generated, we've got to try and capture that revenue and not only try to borrow in terms of dealing with the finance deficit that exists. So I think there are some serious issues in terms of public debt management. I think the last point on the public debt management is that we have to have rules on what we use this money for. Yeah. We cannot make use of this money for consumptive type efforts that are not going to lead to growth. And I think the issue here the highly indebted poor countries, the multilateral debt drive that was done in the 90s, even in the 70s, to try and deal with lowering the proportion of debt that African countries had. Some are finding themselves back there because primarily, how is that debt being allocated and made use of? It must be used for public infrastructure. It cannot be used for consumptive purposes that are not growth enhancing. And if you don't have these rules within a country and a national state, you'll find that the poverty cycle and the debt trap continues.
Sia, I want to reflect a bit on comments made by the French President Emmanuel Macron. He called earlier for a new deal for Africa. But the wider question is, what kind of deal is required to respond to the broader and long-standing and so far unaddressed challenges facing the continent? What does that look like?
Sure. So I think in the context of what the European countries and the French president is thinking in his mind is providing additional sort of financing assistance, whether that be through the commitment that they've made to the IMF to provide an additional 650 billion SDRs, which would be then voluntarily requested upon advanced economies to unlend at a concessional basis to African countries. But I don't think that that's necessarily the right way out of this quagmire we face. I think in as much as we can criticize African countries for the use of the funds that they're borrowing from international financing institutions, they also find themselves in a difficult position with balance of crisis challenges due to the global lockdown as well as the slow recovery on the continent. And so what really needs to be done is to improve and help African countries restructure their economies, move away from a dependency on commodities towards manufactured goods, but at the same time establish local productive capacity in terms of vaccines. And that is really the only way that we can deal with the dual problem of the pandemic as well as the economic recovery.
Now, speaking on the matter of vaccinations, what did you make of the sweeping calls for a massive financial and vaccination support for Africa and a broader sea change in relations between donor nations and the continent, among the other goals that President Macron outlined?
So I think that's a positive step, particularly given the amount of support that South Africa and India has requested the World Trade Organization in terms of the TRIPS waiver, which basically says we're trying to enable developing countries to produce their vaccines locally by suspending intellectual property rights for a limited period. But I don't think that that is the only sort of solution that's necessary, because even if we are able to produce the vaccine locally, we still face significant challenges in terms of infrastructure development that prohibit equitable distribution of the vaccines across all countries. And so we need to have a dual approach of localizing the production of vaccines, particularly if we're going to be prepared for future pandemics, but at the same time also deal with the major infrastructure deficit as highlighted by Dr. Moleko earlier in terms of what our governments are actually using a lot of the financing they're borrowing in terms of investment locally.
Well, I'll return a bit later to this conversation around vaccines. But to Dr. Moleko now, President Macron also said that an economic and strategic new deal with Africa would not just happen overnight, but the talks had triggered a new dynamic. Would you agree with the sentiment? And are you getting an impression of more lobbying from developed countries to support nations in Africa?
I think that the new deal for Africa would mean that we must increase our manufacturing value add as a proportion of GDP. The New Deal must mean that we must industrialize, that finance is going to strengthen our economic muscle to produce our own goods, to make sure that the food that we consume, the processed goods that we consume, the things that we put in our homes, the very things that you and I use daily, electronic goods, enable us to grow and stabilize employment and make sure that poverty and inequality go down. That is when we're talking about a new deal that enables us to export manufactured goods, that exports manufactured and also beneficiated processed minerals that are not raw. That's a new deal that enables us to access export markets into Europe, Americas, and these developed economies. That's a new deal. I think unless we're talking about that, I'm not sure what the new deal is. If we're going to get given more debt and not necessarily make use of this debt to change the structural growth path of economies, I don't know what this new deal is, but I haven't looked at the details. Unfortunately, I've heard the semantic that talks about a new deal being proposed. If that new deal is talking about that, then we're talking about a new deal. However, if we're not looking at how we are going to improve the macro fundamentals of the economic outcomes of the African economy, it doesn't look like then it's a new deal. It may be semantics. But I think I just want to add a point to that to say it is encouraging, though, to see that international financiers would be developing new instruments to give to African economies. You must remember, the level of financial development across East Africa, North Africa, Western, Southern, there are different regional economic blocks. So the level of financial development across the continent is not homogeneous. We know that South Africa, Egypt, Nigeria have more advanced financial markets, financial stock markets. Many other markets or financial systems don't have advanced bond markets, don't have advanced stock exchanges. So when you're talking about some of the financing and the financing activities that are being offered, countries are not necessarily on the same level. So what we've got to look at is what is good for Benin, Guinea-Bissau, Chad is not necessarily what is needed for South Africa, Kenya, and the likes of Uganda or Nigeria for that matter. So we've got to look at are the instruments that we're talking about a blanket approach? Probably that is not what is needed for the 54 economies on the continent. But we've got to have an approach that says the high income, the low income, the medium income, and we try to stabilize liquidity in the markets. We try to ensure that the growth reforms that come with the finance and investments improve all the economic indices and outcomes, particularly when you're talking about not having a one mineral-led growth path, which is the bulk of the problem on this continent.
Well, Dr. Moleko and Sia, let's take a quick break. And after the break, we find out if there's been this paradigm shift that is underway in how more developed countries are engaging with nations on the African continent. Don't go anywhere. Do stay with us. If you're just joining us, a very good evening to you. You're watching Newsfeed, the late night edition with myself and Nhlanhla Sehume. Just a quick reminder, we are speaking to Sia Biniza, who is the Finance and Operations Director at Political Economies South Africa, as well as Dr. Nthabiseng Moleko from the University of Stellenbosch. Sia, I want to continue on sentiments raised by Dr. Moleko a short while ago. And as a follow-up as well, would you say that there is a paradigm shift that is underway in Africa's relationship with these richer nations, from having programs imposed on it to co-constructing what is actually needed on the continent? Sia, if you can hear me, I was just posing a follow-up question to what Dr. Moleko was saying, to ask if you have noticed this paradigm shift that is underway in Africa's relationship with more developed nations.
Sure. I wouldn't really call it a paradigm shift. I think they're pulling and pushing forces. Firstly, the fact that the current pandemic cannot be resolved without everybody, whilst we're leaving people behind. And so, advanced economies are forced to deal with the deficit of how African countries are dealing with the pandemic, whether that be the fact that although Africa has experienced the worst of COVID in terms of job losses, mounting debt, etc., we've only received 2% of the vaccines globally. Yeah. Secondly is the issue of the economic recovery, where African countries have been lagging behind in terms of their investment. As mentioned, unlike advanced economies which have used their central banks as lenders of last resort, African countries have had to knock on the doorstep of the IMF in terms of assistance. And so I wouldn't say there's a paradigm shift more than the international financing institutions being forced to deal with the crisis before it blows out of control. Obviously, the issue of the rising debt is of major concern. Most African countries are now sitting in a position of debt distress or high risk of debt distress. Secondly is the issue of the conflict that's taken place throughout the continent, whether that be West Africa, the Central African region, or the Sahel, which is also worsening the current impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so I think it is more of a fear of matters getting out of control rather than it being a paradigm shift where African countries are defining the policy response on the continent. Definitely not at this point. And it seems as though it's really either an issue of European guilt or the fact that they cannot leave any person behind in the COVID-19 pandemic recovery.
Dr. Moleko, let's backtrack a bit. More than a year in the making, this meeting was backdropped by a series of bleak statistics on the pandemic and its toll on Africa. If the continent has been less hard hit by this pandemic than other places, it is suffering in many other ways, with tourism and other revenues simply just drying up. Would you agree that there is a wider impact from this pandemic?
Certainly, I think that there is no subsector that has been left untouched. We know that depending on the level of lockdown, I know South Africa's lockdown measures have been quite stringent, and they've literally, I think in the second quarter of last year, we saw up to 90% of decline in economic output turnover for many of the subsectors which were completely shut down. I think the same was experienced for some subsectors across the northern parts of the continent that are to our counterparts. I think tourism, definitely. We've seen a massive losses of revenue across the value chain of tourism. We've seen agro-processing rebounding much better than other subsectors, primarily because of the inelasticity of food. So everyone consumes food irrespective of what is happening. Otherwise, we will all starve. I think the other subsectors we've seen recover quite well are your trade sectors, primarily because of trade, and we import the majority of those goods. The long-term effect of that is that most of the African composition of sectoral composition to GDP across the East, West, and Northern Southern African counterpart, you see that the level of trade is equivalent primarily to government consumption or government expenditure. Equivalent is your investment levels and what we measure as your consumption,
right,
household and SMME consumption. So what is interesting is that the proportion that's going to trade, i.e. what we produce and we're able to sell outside, as a proportion of GDP is equivalent to government expenditure. This is not necessarily a good thing, because if you're trying to expand economic output, economic recovery, we have recovered far less quicker than economies that have a strong industrial proportion in the economic system. So I think that every subsector, there is none that has been unaffected, primarily in the informal space. So in Africa, you find that there's a large proportion of women in the informal economy, but also you find up to 70% of local economies are those in the informal economy. So the support mechanisms, the mitigating measures such as the unemployment insurance are not for those in the informal sector, but for the formal sector. Some of the rebates are for the formal sector, and all those type of measures don't necessarily reach your informal sector, which is a large proportion of the majority of our African economies. And so you're finding that the recovery and the poverty levels have increased quite substantially. Those who fell out of poverty and are back in poverty primarily because of the effect of lockdown. So what this means is that we actually have more work to do than we had before. Those that have recovered and are back in poverty, those that have actually come out of it in the last 5-10 years because of the effect of the economic shock of COVID, businesses are closing down, and we're seeing quite a significant effect in South Africa as well of this type of outcome. So we've got to really do things differently and more effectively so that we can see different outcomes. So this is seriously impacting all subsectors.
Sia, let's break down these numbers, and just looking at the forecasts that are being shown right now, just over 3%, or rather Africa's economy is expected to grow by just over 3% this year, about half the world average. It also faces a nearly $300 million billion spending shortfall over the next few years. However, experts fear that millions more Africans may tip into poverty, and less than 3% of Africans have been vaccinated against this coronavirus. These statistics paint a very bleak picture, wouldn't you say?
I think definitely, and if I must add anything to what Dr. Moleko has highlighted in terms of the most severe impact on the informal sector, is that this is now creating a policy dilemma. Firstly, because the informal sector is generally undocumented in terms of economic performance, and so what we're seeing in that the numbers being produced are better than expected. From a policy perspective, this is dangerous, because in as much as the numbers might look better than expected, the actual impact on livelihoods, on, average citizens is much worse than anything that we could have expected. And so, yes, we're in a very difficult economic environment, and it's placed in a significant amount of pressure on policymakers to find a way to deal with the informal sector and informalization, whilst also ensuring that on the macro side we are stable in order to be able to deal with any further shocks that we face in future.
Dr. Moleko, I want us to return to the issue of vaccines, and I'll take from comments made by President Cyril Ramaphosa, who took part in the talks. He said it is unacceptable that only 2% of the people living on the African continent have been vaccinated. He also spoke about, or rather spoke against, vaccine apartheid in an interview with the French TV news network France 24. What message, in your opinion, do you think that the president is trying to drive?
I think that what's important is he's saying that let's ensure that access to all resources are made available, particularly those that will help most of the poorest of the poor actually be able to come out of the economic crises and the health crises that we are currently in. I think more importantly for me is the message that says that we cannot, as Africa, rely on outsiders and everyone else for our salvation. The African people have got to come up with their own mechanisms. I think Sia mentioned it. If we have a crisis on healthcare, why are we not resolving the issue by generating our own solutions? We have got to develop our own systems and solutions to our problems fundamentally. I think on the financial side, to supplement this issue that we're talking about today, we are talking about finance raising capital to meet our debt, or rather our finance gap. And the estimations are quite big, whether you look at infrastructure finance or just in terms of meeting our fiscus and our needs as a continent. We've got, in South Africa, as an example, massive domestic surpluses, almost 8 trillion. If you look at pension markets, are we even using our own savings and accumulated pensions? And I'm not saying take this money, give it to the state. No. What we're talking about is creating infrastructure asset class. What we're talking about is developing local currency bond markets, in ensuring that as a people, we start to look at our own solutions and the spillovers of having our own solutions on capital markets in the healthcare space. There are preventative ways that are natural, that are found on the continent. Why are we not using our local solutions, our local ways to try and get out of problems, whether it's from a financial issue or from a health perspective? And I think that we've got to be proactive and look at local source interventions that will help us get out of some of the problems we're in. The solutions are here. The answers are actually here. South Africa has massive capital. Pension fund investments can be targeted towards strategic investments that are growth enhancing. We can even lend to the African continent. But the problem is we always want to look outside. I'm not sure what it is in our thinking, but I always propose that let's look at our domestic surpluses. There are existing mechanisms in our local currency bond markets. We can create an infrastructure asset class. Alternative investments is what it's called. There are DFIs across the continent, even in this country, that are strong. But we've got to look at making use of developmental financial instruments that speak to the problems we have. China solved their own problems. They didn't necessarily go to the West. Singapore solved its own problems. All the other countries that we're talking about didn't necessarily call a summit, right, and say, hey, we need your help. They actually looked inwards and said, what can we do to reverse some of the outflows, to slow down some of the adverse effects? We may need some support, but we've got some local and domestic resources and allocation of answers that I believe we can actually look at and solve our own problems. Let's solve the problems. That's my solution. Let's solve the problems.
Sia, as we wrap up, you heard from Dr. Moleko there. The solutions are here. They are in Africa. And interestingly, the Democratic Republic of the Congo's president, Felix Tshisekedi, who is also the AU chair, said having Africans manufacture and also supply COVID-19 vaccines could help overcome the reluctance among some of the Africans being inoculated with foreign shots. Do you agree with the sentiment?
I think definitely. Look, our experience of relying on outsiders for development hasn't got the best of track records. Hence, we approach anything externally as a society with skepticism. However, our leaders seem to have a heavy reliance on external influence in order to solve our domestic problems. From my point of view, we need to find a way to produce locally. I do accept that the path towards sustainable development in Africa through localized capital accumulation is a slow process, and it is like crossing the river, feeling the stones at the bottom of the riverbed. However, our policies now need to support that vision, and I think initiatives such as the Africa Free Continental Trade Agreement and others, which reinforce intra-Africa trade, reinforce industrialization on the continent, are a stepping stone and a starting point.
Well, thank you both for that very insightful chat. That's Dr. Nthabiseng Moleko, who's from the University of Stellenbosch, as well as Biniza, who is the Finance and Operations Director at Political Economies South Africa. And just to give a bit of a backdrop over those conversations, it is seeming that Africa is trying to find its own solutions, although heeding the call for some intervention from more developed countries. After the break, we speak about Eskom's wage negotiations with unions. Don't go anywhere.